get started, folks. Good evening to all of you, and welcome once again to the monthly lecture series here at the Arcata Marsh. My name is Kimbel. I'm on the board, and these lectures are brought to you by Friends of the Arcata Marsh, a group of volunteers that will greet visitors at the desk or lead the Saturday tours at 2 o'clock. If you haven't done that and discovered what's happening here at the Marsh, it's a good way to get your fingers into it. Last month we heard from a Dr. Jeff Kane about fires in California, and the number that I remember taking away from that was that fires have doubled in California in the last 30, 40 years, thanks largely to global warming, so they're going to do it again. Well, tonight we're going to listen to Aaron Kelly in the same department about the bigger picture of forestry and the combination with policy and cap and trade here in California. I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. Typically, we have an hour and then more time for questions. Is that good? And let's see, next month on the 24th, we'll have a speaker on water issues in California, particularly how to use gray water in the consumer market. Okay, so with no further ado, Dr. Aaron Kelly, welcome.
Thanks. Thanks, Elliot. Just to make sure this works. Oh, yeah. All right, so initially I was just going to talk about the cap and trade market, but actually I got an email asking if I would talk a little bit about Arcata Community Forest as well. So I'm going to talk about the cap and trade market and the voluntary markets and how we sell carbon from forests on these markets. And I already heard one concern about carbon trading in forestry and whether it's greenwashing. And I do want to just emphasize I'm not like a proponent of cap and trade markets, but it's something that I study and something that my graduate students have studied. And so two of my graduate students are listed here, Joanna D. Tomaso and Marissa Schmitz. They've been doing a lot of work on landowners entering the market and how they enter the market and kind of the politics behind the market. So just wanted to give them credit. The talk tonight is going to be, so it's going to be about forestry, but it's going to be about the politics behind paying people and the policies of paying people to manage forests differently for some purpose. And the purpose that we'll talk about tonight is for carbon sequestration. And really, part of what we're paying people under the carbon market to do is to not cut trees, or to not cut trees as quickly, or to cut trees in a different way. And so part of the challenge of the carbon market has been putting dollar values on things like ecosystem services, like the value of a tree that's not cut down. So the value of that carbon sequestration. These are things that we didn't historically think of as goods. So I guess there's a little bit of a connection to places like marshes, because if we can put a value on a complex ecosystem process, or ecosystem like forests, could we put a value on something like the marsh, a dollar value? And this is where people, I think, sometimes have some discomfort with carbon markets. So there are two big premises. One is that the cap and trade market is about putting dollar values on things that are really difficult to quantify, so we'll talk about how people have gone about doing that. And forestry is a great example of something that is incredibly difficult to quantify, forest carbon. And then the second premise is that the cap and trade market is a state-created market. So without the state, it wouldn't exist. And so a lot of politics have gone into creating this market. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well. And I'm going to talk about this as a series of questions. Just first, why is California addressing climate change? Why isn't the US as a whole? How is California addressing it? What are protocols for forestry projects? So, sorry.
No, I seen that yesterday. That's so funny.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
This is from the Arcata Community Forest. So what are the protocols? So how do you get a forestry project from a forest into a market? And then who's participating and what does all this mean, potentially? So first, why is California addressing climate change? And I'm going to not really talk about climate change per se, because I'm going to assume that everybody has a basic understanding, but about the policies behind climate change. And so if you go back to the late 80s, there was a panel put together, an intergovernmental panel on climate change. And they started putting together the best scientific knowledge they could gather. And in 1990, they came out with a report, the first IPCC assessment, and they said, we think climate change is real. There was some degree of scientific uncertainty, but their findings were strong enough that in 1992, the UN convened in Rio. They had the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this convention, they recognized a couple of things. One, they recognized that there was a problem. And so part of this problem was that there was a risk from climate change, and they decided that human safety outweighed scientific uncertainty. So that was the first thing. The second thing that they decided was that they were going to set a goal to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions. And the third thing they decided was that they were going to place the onus of stabilizing greenhouse gas emissions on developed countries. And so this was mostly the United States and European countries. So that came out in 1992. And the 195 parties have signed this framework convention. So it's signed by basically, those are all countries, it's signed by basically everyone in the world. But more controversially, a lot of policies came out of this. And so we have these meetings called the Conference of the Parties. They're called COPs. And I don't know if you guys have heard about climate meetings recently. There was one in Doha, one in Copenhagen. You probably read about it in the newspaper. And the most famous of these COPs was in Kyoto, and that was in 1997. And that was when the Kyoto Protocol was accepted. And so the Kyoto Protocol actually started to put some policies, started to say, here's how we're going to reduce emissions, and started to put some concrete steps in place. And so how did the US respond to Kyoto? Do you guys remember?
Not much.
We didn't sign it, right?
Yeah.
Right, they didn't sign it, right.
All at the state level.
Yeah, so what happened was, Annex B parties here, these are the developed countries essentially. What they said were developed countries. They're in green and purple, and they had binding targets. And they ratified the agreement. The blue countries ratified the Kyoto Protocol. Canada, which is in yellow, withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol a couple of years ago. And then, of course, the US never ratified the Kyoto Protocol, made it really clear that we were not going to ratify it. And I actually went back to look at some newspaper articles from the time, and if you remember, Larry Craig from Idaho just had this very angry, he was a senator in the Republican-controlled Senate at the time, and he said, we're going to kill this. It's very strong, it was not going anywhere. So California saw this and saw, that the Kyoto Protocol, that the United States was not going to take action as a country. And really, it was in 1999, just a couple of years after Kyoto Protocol, that Gray Davis and a senator named Byron Scher, a state senator, started deciding that they were going to go at it alone, that California was going to address climate change alone. And so the first step to do this, they decided, was to measure how much California was emitting. So the first step to controlling it was to measure the greenhouse gases that California was emitting. In 2001, the state established the California Climate Action Registry. And this registry started to just allow industries to voluntarily report their emissions, trying to get a sense of how many emissions they had, and then it became compulsory. They started also including forests as a reporting industry, and the California Climate Action Registry eventually evolved into what you see here, the Climate Action Reserve. And if you ever have questions about California policies on cap and trade or greenhouse gas emission reduction, the Climate Action Reserve is a great place to go. It's now operated independently of the state. It's a nonprofit. But 2006 was the big year for California, so they've been collecting the emissions data, and Assembly Bill 32 came out. And this was the first time that California said, okay, we think we know how many emissions the state is emitting, and we're going to put an actual cap. And so what they said was, we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. And they said, here's where we think the business as usual emissions will be. Here's where we were in 1990. So we've got about 80 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. That's the metric that we're using, million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. So that's the reduction that we're working towards. And the big thing is that by 2050, greenhouse gas emissions should be reduced a further 80%. This is the goal. All right, so how do we do this? How do you get California to reduce its emissions? You guys have any ideas?
Try guilt first.
Guilt first, okay, like public education?
Yeah.
Okay, and I think public education's, being tried. Yeah?
Tax credits for solar power.
Okay, incentives. Yeah, give people incentives to change their own, energy mix.
Mandate the utilities to incorporate renewables.
Okay, good. Mandate utilities to incorporate renewables, which certainly that's part of it. The big one is that a lot of people have is to tax carbon emissions, and that didn't happen in California. We weren't able to get a tax. Do you guys want to? There are probably multiple reasons why. One of the big reasons is that a tax requires 2/3 approval by the legislature. Whereas things like fees only require a majority. So taxes are simple, but difficult.
So there's no gasoline tax in California?
Well, there are gas taxes.
Oh, there are gas.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. There's not like a carbon tax.
Yeah,
specifically for carbon.
Okay.
So what California ended up doing is separating all the industries in California into two sectors, capped and uncapped sectors. Capped sectors include, they emit about 80% of the emissions. And so this is like cement plants, coal refineries, also all the gasoline, the electrical grid. Uncapped sectors include things like agriculture and forestry. And so what California did was said, here's what we think business as usual will be in 2020. Here's the targets. So that's a difference of 80 million metric tons. And then they said direct regulatory measures, which is part of what you were mentioning. The capped sectors will reduce by 50 million metric tons. Uncapped will reduce by 12 million metric tons through regulation. And then they said, we're going to set up a cap and trade market. And this cap and trade market only applies to those capped sectors. But we're going to force all these major players like Exxon and Shell into our cap and trade market. So that's how the cap and trade market was set up. But you'll notice forestry is not mandated to be in the cap and trade market. So I'll talk about how forestry fits with it. As soon as I very quickly describe the cap and trade market, I just wanted to go over this quickly because cap and trade markets, people talk about them a lot, but it's not always clear that there's understanding of them. So coal refinery A is on your left. And they're emitting a certain amount of, in this case, carbon. This is the pollutant. They're emitting less than their allowed cap in this illustration. Coal refinery B is on the right, and they're emitting above their allowed cap. So coal refinery B has three options. They can buy allowances. These can be issued by the government through auctions. So California issues allowances. And it's generated about $500 million a year for California. Or they can buy allowances directly from refinery A, setting up that market exchange. Right? Because the idea is that this is a market. They can buy offsets, which means you go and you pay someone else to sequester your carbon for you. So you might pay forest owners to sequester carbon, more carbon than they would have without a market. And the third is technology. So coal refinery B could invest in better technology so that they weren't emitting as much. Now, over time, the cap gets smaller. And so, in theory at least, it becomes less and less feasible for coal refinery B to keep just emitting pollutants. right? Because they have to be paying for all these pollutants. So that's how a cap and trade market works, essentially. And so forests were included in the second category. They're included as offsets. You go and pay forest landowners to sequester for your emissions. And there are three types. There's improved forest management. So basically a landowner says, I'm going to sequester more carbon because I'm going to practice forestry differently. Maybe longer rotations, maybe not clear cutting, only selective harvests. There's avoided conversion and there's reforestation. By far the most common is improved forest management. And this is really the innovative thing that California has done. Nobody really tried to pay people to improve their forest management. So, if you look at international programs, a lot of times there's kind of payment for reforestation or to protect forests. And in California, they said we're going to set up a system to pay people to improve forest management. And I should mention that these projects can be anywhere in the U.S. So even though it's a California market, the forests can be anywhere in the U.S. So those are the types of offsets that we have. How do you think you would, what does improved forest management mean, do you think?
Well, we know that suppression of fires is a bad thing. We can get rid of that.
Okay, that's excellent. The market has not figured out a good way to deal with fire.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So actually, one of the big risks that California is undertaking, I guess, is that the risk of what they call reversal. Unintentional, which would be like from fire, or intentional, which would be, is easier to deal with. But unintentional reversal is, we created buffer pools,
Yeah.
but the market doesn't actually deal with the problems of suppression very well. That's good.
Well, I think improved depends on the objective.
Yeah,
And, the carbon sequestration objective might differ from some other objective.
That's
But
right.
if you, it all depends on what you want to get out of it. But if you could just say that, the approach that most closely mimics natural processes, if you can convince yourself that accomplishes the most objectives.
That's great. And in fact, Byron Scher, the state senator who got forestry into the market, put in a little piece where he emphasized the need to manage for natural forest management. And this was because people didn't want what they called carbon plantations. So you could just put a bunch of non-native pine trees that might grow really fast and sequester a lot of carbon. But the idea was actually to manage for a bunch of benefits. So yeah, natural forest management was part of it. And that has become extremely contentious, what that means. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about how does a forestry project get into the market? What are the rules? And some of this, I'm just going to go quickly through some of the history of this, just to emphasize the kind of political nature. And then I'll talk about how you actually get a project to the market. So in 2001, you have the creation of the registry, start counting emissions. In 2005, the first protocol comes out. And this was really developed by land trusts, for the most part. So one of the predominant land trusts in this was Pacific Forest Trust. They own the Van Eck Forest, which is just out of town. And land trusts really had some ideas about how this market would work. Give a financial incentive to landowners to manage their forests with longer rotations, to let trees grow older and bigger. This was a big part of it. Providing landowners with new revenue. So the idea was that landowners would have an alternative revenue stream to timber production. Now, version 1.0 though was really, and some of the early versions favored a lot of land trust ideas. Like you had to have a conservation easement. And so it went through a bunch of versions. It was field tested by land trusts, but then a second working group convened and a lot more players from industry got involved. A lot more representatives from a number of industry groups, but also carbon developers, people who were interested in making making money from this new market. And they started to see the potential to make a lot of money on carbon sales from forests. And so the protocols changed pretty dramatically. And one thing that happened was that the natural forest management kind of went through a long process of negotiation to, some people would say, clarify that, for example, clear cuts were allowed. And there were some other things that changed. You no longer have to have a conservation easement. So a lot of things changed over time with these protocols. What we have though now, oh, and at this time you start seeing voluntary market sales. So if you guys have ever seen anything about the Arcata Community Forest and its carbon sales, it's in the voluntary market. So it's back on using some of the older protocols. We can talk about why they haven't joined the cap and trade market later if you want. But in 2012, the last version, almost the most recent version, called 3.2, becomes what they call the Air Resources Board Protocol. It becomes the cap and trade protocol. So this becomes the compliance market. If you want to sell to Exxon so that they can offset their emissions, you have to use these protocols. If you want to sell in the voluntary market, you can use earlier protocols. And this will matter a little because I'm going to talk about case studies. I'll talk about the Arcata Community Forest, which is voluntary, and then the UROC projects, which are compliance. So forest offsets go through this incredibly elaborate process. Doesn't matter if you're in the voluntary market or if you're in the compliance market, it's a really complex process. So this is a commodity chain. You know, the data is being handed from actor to actor. If you were to think about a wood products commodity chain, it's kind of straightforward, right? There's a tree, maybe there's a consultant who comes out and does inventory, there's a logger, there's a mill, there's a Home Depot. It's kind of, you can trace it because there's wood. But what's being passed along here is actually data, and it's data about carbon. And I wish that I got this in my email just today, but this was an outlook. It's called, you can hardly see it, but it's Timberland Investment Outlook from New Forests. They're a carbon developer. So I just got that today. I didn't have a lot of time to look through it, but they're kind of saying, like, here's some of the value that we see in this carbon market. So what you start with is a feasibility study. And landowners sometimes are directly approached by carbon developers like New Forests who come and say, you know, we'll do a feasibility study to see if you could have a carbon project. And in return, you give us some of the revenue from your carbon project. Consulting foresters can also do the feasibility that a lot of people have is to tax carbon emissions. And that didn't happen in California. We weren't able to get a tax. Do you guys want to? I mean, there are probably multiple reasons why. One of the big reasons is that a tax requires 2/3 approval by the legislature. Whereas things like fees only require a majority. So taxes are simple, but difficult.
So there's no gasoline tax in California?
Oh, there are gas taxes.
Oh, there are gas.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. There's not like a carbon tax.
Yes,
specifically
okay.
for carbon.
Okay.
So what California ended up doing is separating all the industries in California into two sectors, capped and uncapped sectors. Capped sectors include, they emit about 80% of the emissions. And so this is like cement plants, coal refineries, also all of the like gasoline, the electrical grid. Uncapped sectors include things like agriculture and forestry. And so what California did was said, here's what we think business as usual will be in 2020. Here's the targets. So that's a difference of 80 million metric tons. And then they said direct regulatory measures, which is part of what you were mentioning. The capped sectors will reduce by 50 million metric tons. Uncapped will reduce by 12 million metric tons through regulation. And then they said, we're going to set up a cap and trade market. And this cap and trade market only applies to those capped sectors. But we're going to force all these major players like Exxon and Shell into our cap and trade market. So that's how the cap and trade market was set up. But you'll notice forestry is not mandated to be in the cap and trade market. So I'll talk about how forestry fits with it. as soon as I very quickly describe the cap and trade market. I just wanted to go over this quickly because cap and trade markets, people talk about them a lot, but it's not always clear that there's understanding of them. So coal refinery A is on your left, and they're emitting a certain amount of, in this case, carbon. This is the pollutant. They're emitting less than their allowed cap in this illustration. Coal refinery B is on the right, and they're emitting above their allowed cap. So coal refinery B has three options. They can buy allowances. These could be issued by the government through auctions. So California issues allowances, and it's generated about $500 million a year for California. Or they can buy allowances directly from refinery A, setting up that market exchange. Right? Because the idea is that this is a market. They could buy offsets, which means you go and you pay someone else to sequester your carbon for you. So you might pay forest owners to sequester carbon, more carbon than they would have without a market. And the third is technology. So coal refinery B could invest in better technology so that they weren't emitting as much. Now, over time, the cap gets smaller. And so, in theory at least, it becomes less and less feasible for coal refinery B to keep just emitting pollutants, right? Because they have to be paying for all these pollutants. So that's how a cap and trade market works, essentially. And so forests were included in the second category. They're included as offsets. You go and pay forest landowners to sequester for your emissions. And there are three types. There's improved forest management. So basically a landowner says, I'm going to sequester more carbon because I'm going to practice forestry differently. Maybe longer rotations, maybe not clear cutting, only selective harvest. There's avoided conversion and there's reforestation. By far the most common is improved forest management. And this is really the innovative thing that California has done. Nobody really tried to pay people to improve their forest management. So, if you look at international programs, a lot of times there's kind of payment for reforestation or to protect forests. But in California, they said we're going to set up a system to pay people to improve forest management. And I should mention that these projects can be anywhere in the U.S. So even though it's a California market, the forests can be anywhere in the U.S. So those are the types of offsets that we have. How do you think you would, what does improved forest management mean, do you think?
Well, we know that suppression of fires is a bad thing. We can get rid of that.
Okay, that's excellent. The market has not figured out a good way to deal with fire.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So actually, one of the big risks that California is undertaking, I guess, is that the risk of what they call reversal. Unintentional, which would be like from fire, or intentional, which would be, is easier to deal with. But unintentional reversal is, we created buffer pools, but the market doesn't actually deal with the problems of suppression very well. That's good.
Well, I think improved depends on the objective.
Yeah.
And, the carbon sequestration objective might differ from some other objective. But
right.
if you, it all depends on what you want to get out of it. But if you could just say that, the approach that most closely mimics natural processes, if you can convince yourself that accomplishes the most objectives.
That's great. And in fact, Byron Scher, the state senator who got forestry into the market, put in a little piece where he emphasized the need to manage for natural forest management. And this was because people didn't want what they called carbon plantations. So you could just put a bunch of non-native pine trees that might grow really fast and sequester a lot of carbon. But the idea was actually to manage for a bunch of benefits. So yeah, natural forest management was part of it. And that has become extremely contentious, what that means. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about how does a forestry project get into the market? What are the rules? And some of this, I'm just going to go quickly through some of the history of this, just to emphasize the kind of political nature. And then I'll talk about how you actually get a project to the market. So in 2001, you have the creation of the registry, start counting emissions. In 2005, the first protocol comes out. And this was really developed by land trusts, for the most part. So one of the predominant land trusts in this was Pacific Forest Trust. They own the Van Eck Forest, which is just out of town. And land trusts really had some ideas about how this market would work. Give a financial incentive to landowners to manage their forests with longer rotations, to let trees grow older and bigger. This was a big part of it. Providing landowners with new revenue. So the idea was that landowners would have like an alternative revenue stream to timber production. Now, version 1.0 though was really, and some of the early versions favored a lot of land trust ideas. Like you had to have a conservation easement. And so it went through a bunch of versions. It was field tested by land trusts, but then a second working group convened and a lot more players from industry got involved. A lot more representatives from a number of industry groups, but also carbon developers, people who were interested in making money from this new market. And they started to see the potential to make a lot of money on carbon sales from forests. And so the protocols changed pretty dramatically. And one thing that happened was that the natural forest management kind of went through a long process of negotiation to, some people would say, clarify that, for example, clear cuts were allowed. And there were some other things that changed. You no longer have to have a conservation easement. So a lot of things changed over time with these protocols. What we have though now, and at this time you start seeing voluntary market sales. So if you guys have ever seen anything about the Arcata Community Forest and its carbon sales, it's in the voluntary market. So it's back on using some of the older protocols. We can talk about why they haven't joined the cap and trade market later if you want. But in 2012, the last version, almost the most recent version, called 3.2, becomes what they call the Air Resources Board Protocol. It becomes the cap and trade protocol. So this becomes the compliance market. If you want to sell to Exxon so that they can offset their emissions, you have to use these protocols. If you want to sell in the voluntary market, you can use earlier protocols. And this will matter a little because I'm going to talk about case studies. I'll talk about the Arcata Community Forest, which is voluntary, and then the UROC projects, which are compliance. So forest offsets go through this incredibly elaborate process. Doesn't matter if you're in the voluntary market or if you're in the compliance market, it's a really complex process. So this is a commodity chain. You know, the data is being handed from actor to actor. If you were to think about a wood products commodity chain, it's kind of straightforward, right? There's a tree, maybe there's a consultant who comes out and does inventory, there's a logger, there's a mill, there's a Home Depot. It's kind of, you can trace it because there's wood. But what's being passed along here is actually data, and it's data about carbon. And I wish that I got this in my email just today, but this was an outlook. It's called, you can hardly see it, but it's Timberland Investment Outlook from New Forests. They're a carbon developer. So I just got that today. I didn't have a lot of time to look through it, but they're kind of saying, like, here's some of the value that we see in this carbon market. So what you start with is a feasibility study. And landowners sometimes are directly approached by carbon developers like New Forests who come and say, you know, we'll do a feasibility study to see if you could have a carbon project. And in return, you give us some of the revenue from your carbon project. Consulting foresters can also do the feasibility study, like BBW is a local consulting forestry group. The second step then, if you have a feasible project, is to design the project, to do inventory. The third step is verification, so you have a third party come and make sure that you're doing what you say you're doing. Fourth step is registration. You go on to that, to a registry, and this is where your carbon actually gets a number and you can now sell it to someone, like Exxon if you're in the compliance market. The fifth step then is marketing and sale of the offsets. And the really interesting thing about this commodity chain is that once you sell it, you're not done. There's a permanent requirement, obligation, where you maintain inventories. So you maintain the inventory, verification. You do these steps over and over for 100 years past your last date of sale of carbon. It makes it a very different kind of good. Okay, so from offsets are conservative in a way. So there could be greenwashing going on, which Kevin mentioned as a concern earlier. This is certainly possible, but California did try and make this market as conservative as possible because they watched a lot of markets fail, like the European market, Chicago Climate Exchange. They have actually watched a lot of markets fail because people, either they flooded the market with allowances and offsets, or because maybe the offsets didn't actually have value. So in AB 32, California said offsets have to be real, permanent, quantifiable, verifiable, and enforceable. And these words were used in the legislation, and I'll show you how this kind of works through two case studies. One is the UROC project, which is in the compliance market, and one is the Arcata Community Forest project. Okay, so the UROC project, they used new forests. So they used this carbon developer, and you can go there and learn about the UROC project. You can also go to the Climate Action Reserve website. And a lot of this data is really available. It's very, it's a very public program, which is kind of nice. And the UROC project, just so I get the numbers right, it's about 7,600 acres. And they got 700,000 offsets, which is at about, roughly $10 an offset. So that's about $7 million. And one thing about this UROC project is that they were able to get land, former green diamond land, partly by leveraging the sale of carbon offsets. So the UROC tribe was actually able to acquire land through somewhat through the revenues they were going to get through carbon.
Would you repeat the number of acres again?
The project is 7,600 acres. It doesn't mean that's the full amount of land. They've gotten more land than that from Green Diamond. But this project is 7,600. Okay, so the credits have to be real. This means that they have to be accurate, they have to be based on the protocols. And one thing about it, so here are the actual, that's kind of hard to see, but here's the project, and here it's kind of blown up. And the UROC project has 589 sampling plots. So each of these is a sampling plot. So part of this requirement that it's real is that they're very heavily inventoried. They have a lot of sampling plots. There's a very good idea of how much carbon is out there. There could be arguments about, there's a difference between like what's real and what's accurate. They're at least very accurate. Right? They're going out, they're measuring all the standing live trees, standing dead, and carbon on the floor. So part of this necessity of having real carbon out there is that you have to be, in improved forest management, you have to demonstrate that you're going to do additional, that you're going to sequester more carbon than you would in the absence of a market. And so what the protocol designers did is they went out and found that the FIA, the Forest Inventory and Analysis database, which is maintained by the U.S. Forest Service, has established plots across the United States in all different kinds of forests. And they said, all right, we're going to say that this is common practice. And so it's based on, these are called supersections, they're roughly ecoregions. So the UROC project is in this ecoregion. It's dominated by a Douglas fir tan oak. The Arcata Community Forest is in a different ecoregion. So they have slightly different expectations. The common practice of the area is considered slightly different. So that's what we call common practice. Here's how much carbon we expect to find out there. So if you're demonstrating additionality, you start with common practice. And this is how much carbon you have. You then include legal obligations. And some of this is economic constraints too. And you call this business as usual. So you start with common practice, you include your legal obligations, so there's more carbon that you're expected to have out there. And then what you model at the beginning is, here's how much carbon you have on the forest, and you are promising to grow that carbon, or at least after a while maintain it. Now this line would look more like this, because you're probably going to have some harvests. But over time, you're expected to maintain that carbon for 100 years past the last date of sale. So basically, between these two lines, that's how much money you get. That much carbon. That's what you're paid for. Okay, so that's how we demonstrate additionality. This is from the UROC projects. Baseline stocking is modeled here. You can't really see, but this is standing dead, below ground live and live above ground carbon. And so what you see is baseline, they said, here's what we could have done. Here's our business as usual. If we'd used a lot of clear cutting, we think we could have done this. And they said, we're going to do a project where we do this, and we want you to pay us. And that's essentially what a project is. So that's the UROC additionality. I just wanted to show a slightly different view of this. So they're saying baseline is here. So that's that common practice plus their legal obligations. They're saying are at this level, this is what they say their periodic harvest is. So here's how much they say they're going to remove, and then here's what they're modeling as their above ground additional carbon sequestration. So that's additionality. I'm going to speak really briefly about verification in the Arcata Community Forest. One thing about Arcata Community Forest is that, as I mentioned, it's in the voluntary market. So in the compliance market, as I said, you might be Exxon or a coal refinery, but who buys voluntary credits?
If you're overpolluting,
Yeah, maybe. So anybody who feels like they want to buy, I've bought Arcata Community Forest credits just to kind of see how it works. And because anybody who wants to offset their own emissions can voluntarily buy offsets in the voluntary market. So if you go to the City of Arcata website, this is a brochure, it's supposed to be folded in 3 ways, but you get the idea that they're selling carbon offsets, they're selling them for $10 a metric ton. It is registered on the Climate Action Reserve, and they kind of give an explanation. Perhaps to offset holiday travel, conferences, gifts. You can buy them from the City of Arcata, and you're going to pay the City of Arcata to sequester additional carbon. And it gives you kind of an idea of how much you're offsetting, and it's a neat, kind of boutique approach to carbon markets. The voluntary market is very different from the cap and trade market. The voluntary market, unfortunately, it's a little harder to get people to buy voluntarily. It's easier to tell people they have to buy offsets, or they have to at least participate in the cap and trade market. Okay, so just like in the cap and trade market, the Arcata Community Forest goes through verification. It's a very rigorous process. They have a third party come and check that they're doing what they say they're doing. In this case, it's SCS Global. And they put out regular reports. And if you look at the objectives, they're reviewing data, and they're following protocol version 3.1. So you know that this is not compliance. This was an older protocol. And if you go to the Climate Action Reserve website, you can get all of these documents about, this is just the Sunny Bray Tract. Actually, Arcata Community Forest has 3 projects. And you'll get one that has the physical boundary map. This is the project submittal form, so actually what they were, their project document. And then all of these are verification reports. And so there's a lot of kind of documentation. This is a good that is invisible and it's abstract and it exists in data. It's the promise to sequester more carbon. So verification is a huge part of the process. Okay, so that's how you get into the market generally. And I'll just share very quickly who's participating. This is as of April 2015. And I'll just give you a couple ideas. So the landowner type on the left includes conservation landowners. This is land trusts mostly. Industry. NIPF is non-industrial private forest landowners, so small kind of family forest landowners. Other, and the other is really interesting. Investor-owned municipalities, hunt clubs, church, there's one church, sculpture garden, and gated community. So the other is really a grab bag. TIMOs, which are an investor type, and tribes. And
This is California.
this is the whole US. I'll show you actually the portion that's in California in a second. So conservation, you'll see, they have the most projects, but they're a little bit smaller. Industry has very large projects. And we can talk about why that is, if you'd like. TIMOs have even larger. So TIMOs are a type of industry, but they're an investment group. And I think all the tribal projects are in California at this point. But here you see, 3 of the 4. So located in California, most of the industry, 12 out of 15 are located in California, and almost all of those actually are Sierra Pacific. I think there's one that's Mendocino. So industry dominates in California, or is mostly in California. Family forest landowners are mostly in California, which kind of makes sense because I think a lot of family forest landowners elsewhere haven't even heard of this market. But you do see a lot of, especially TIMOs, 6 out of the 7 are in other states. These are investor groups. They're very savvy about finding value for their forests, and they're more likely to jump on these kinds of things. So this shows you just by this landowner type, the credits that they're getting per acre. It kind of tells you how much carbon is out there, how much above that baseline is out there per acre. And so what you see is that maybe somewhat unsurprisingly, industry is not getting a lot of credits per acre. So they have low stocking, but remember they have really big projects. So they're making these projects pay by having extensive, large projects with relatively low stocking on them. Conservation is actually in the middle, and this is probably because they're often doing kind of restoration projects. Family forest owners have a lot of credits per acre. Part of this is because to make it work, if you look at the average acres, they have small projects. It's expensive to go through the inventory and verification process. So you either have to have a lot of land or you have to have a lot of carbon per acre. Other has, I mean, again, other, it's hard to even say what, and TIMOs have incredibly low stocking. Conservation easements, of course, conservation groups are likely to have conservation easements, industry is not. Public funding, so a lot of conservation groups are getting public funding for carbon projects. And it's a way, again, to acquire more land for both conservation groups and tribes. And then you see tenure change. So for conservation groups and tribes, there's often a purchase of the land right after there's a tenure change. So what you see is they're leveraging this based on the carbon revenues.
What's public funding? From where?
Well, it would be some, I'm not totally sure. I mean, it would be diverse sources from these different groups, but it could be some sort of funding to do restoration. It's essentially, actually, for the tribes, it would be funding to acquire the land outright. So it would be funding, you know, Okay, so the last thing I'll talk about is kind of what all this means. And this is from the Van Eyck project over here, which is one of the first projects. It's a conservation land trust that owns it. And part of it is that forest landowners might have additional revenue streams. So the idea of this is that you can maintain forests, like for family forest owners, as working forests, because they have this additional source of revenue, and something aside from timber revenue. So it might promote better or different management. But this really assumes they can get into the market. So they can pay all the costs of inventory and verification, and then they can maintain those for 100 years, or at least promise to. Carbon revenues can help leverage resources for land trusts and tribal land purchases. Incentives exist for certain practices, so there are incentives to do more uneven age management. It's easier to do a carbon project if you're going to do selective single tree selection. And it does incentivize longer rotations if you're doing even age management, but it's not clear whether forestry as a whole is going to really change because of this market. It also means that because of the cap and trade market, the state has a lot of money that it needs to spend on greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And so it's kind of an interesting problem, I guess, for the state, that they have a lot of money that they're trying to spend in different ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And it's not always clear how those funds are going to get spent. So $500 million for last year. Okay, the other thing it means that I thought was interesting was that forest projects, they're really entering this political world. Cap and trade markets are incredibly contentious. They're opposed often by environmental justice advocates or reformers who want to see, bigger reforms than just creating a market. And Pope Francis is one of them. And he said, the strategy of buying and selling carbon credits can lead to a new form of speculation, which it has, which would not help reduce the emission of polluting gases worldwide. He went on, and he said, more of it. He said, in no way does it allow for the radical change which present circumstances require. Rather, it may simply become a ploy which permits maintaining excessive consumption of some countries and sectors. So there's opposition because it's not a fundamental enough change to have cap and trade. There's also opposition from the right. So Ted Cruz, when he put out an economic plan, his principle number 2 or whatever, bullet point number 2 was cap and trade is the largest energy tax in history, which would take thousands of dollars from every family in America. And kind of echoing Larry Craig, he said he was going to kill it. So, there's very strong opposition, kind of from two very different sides. And so forestry is entering into this incredibly political world. Forest landowners, I think, are used to kind of politically, a lot of political issues, but certainly the cap and trade market is on a different level. It's global, and there's a lot of eyes on it. And the last point is, I don't know if we've been totally accurate in how we've done it, but we have figured out how to quantify and monetize carbon sequestration in this one complex ecosystem. And so just thinking about the marsh, which I do love, and I come here a lot, would it make sense? Could something like a marsh enter a carbon market? Would it be, would you want to have people paying you to maintain something like a marsh? One of the questions is there kind of a justice issue for, let's say, paying landowners? Do you expect them to manage differently? And the marsh, certainly, it has a lot of benefits, economic as well as environmental. Okay, so these were the topics that I covered just to remind you guys, and I'll be happy to take any questions that you guys have. Yeah.
Do you think that that there are any teeth in any of this that might help combat the conversion of forest lands to pot grows after legalization?
That's a great question. So conversion, it's a real complex question, because certainly after legalization, we don't know actually what will happen to those land prices. But you do see a lot of forest landowners converting to, or parcelizing, breaking up land into smaller pieces and selling it to growers, both in industry and probably a lot of family forest owners as well. And I think in theory, this is a great program for addressing that, because you give, let's say, a remote landowner who might not have access to a mill, who might not want to cut their trees, you give them an alternate source of revenue. I think in practice, for a lot of those landowners, this is a difficult market to get into. And especially the 100-year commitment makes it very, very tough. And so I'm not sure at a large scale how well this will work. Another thing is that the emitters in the cap and trade market, emitters are limited to 8% of their emissions can be offset by these sorts of projects, so 8%. So 92% comes from allowances or other means. So there's actually also kind of a limit to how many offsets you can have. At this point, there's a real shortage of offsets, so there's still room in the market. But I see a lot of projects coming in right now that are coming from large landowners. And in that case, I don't know how much you're slowing down conversion. It's the small, really economically marginal landowners that I think are at a lot of risk. And then also, let's say, a large industrial landowner looking at its kind of marginal lands. So I think the idea is there. The intent. I don't know if the practice is. Yeah.
Well, how long until we would know how effective this is?
Effective at maintaining forests as forests?
Uh-huh.
Or, because there's a couple different types of effectiveness. One would be that we would maintain forests as forests, give landowners an alternate revenue stream. Another is that you actually end up reducing greenhouse gases, right? And I think for the first one, we might know fairly soon, because landowners are entering, there's kind of been a learning process, and they're now landowners are kind of jumping into the market. And so you might see, now is the time for landowners to enter the market. So the effects would be soon. I think in terms of actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions, that has to do with whether forest practices actually change. A big potential problem with the market is leakage. So if you don't cut forests in one place, you're just going to cut forests in another place, right? Because you're still consuming as much as you were before. So the actual reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, I think, comes over time. I think at a large scale, the cap and trade market, I believe, will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But whether it is fast enough is a different question. It's set up to reduce it at a level that's comfortable to emitters.
What would Pope Francis have us do?
I haven't heard any concrete suggestions that he has put out, but he really wants a restructuring of the global economy that better reflects environmental justice issues, right? That helps the poor. And I think that he sees cap and trade as just another way for people to make money, right? So in the forestry sector, you do see this. You do see carbon developers coming in, and in many ways, they're helping landowners to develop these projects. But I think you could also say that, sure, people are just figuring out how to make money. I think there are a lot of benefits from carbon projects. I don't want to say it's all bad at all.
Well,
Pray, Elliot.
pray, yeah.
You might also say pray.
Well, that was the point, though, right? You're capitalizing on how people do business with each other anyway, and turning it to a good cause.
Right. I think that the idea in designing the market is that the state there is an element of the state actually putting pressure on industry to change. But then just designing a market where this can happen, so designing this kind of market mechanism that is a little bit more comfortable, I think, for the emitters. But I think the idea over time is that as that cap gets smaller, you should see a real reduction in emissions. But it's not a fundamental move away from just our, tendency to monetize goods.
Yeah.
So I think that's what Pope Francis would have a problem with.
What were the last major decisions from the last COP in Doha?
I don't know a lot about the recent, I wouldn't be able to answer much about that. I mean, all I watch is the forestry sector, really. And in terms of, if you're interested in kind of global forest projects, the cap and trade market might soon include projects from Mexico. But more commonly, you read about RED Plus, which is reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation. And that's what they deal with at the COPs. And those projects tend to be more about reforestation or protecting existing forest. And a lot of those projects have been held up because there's really uncertain tenure in a lot of countries. So who you give the money to, who the project ends up benefiting is really unclear. So globally, forest projects have not, you do see money going to certain places, but they've been incredibly contentious. Actually, California has done a really good job at getting these projects to where they've gotten them. RED Plus, which is the global system, hasn't had as much success. And a lot of that is because if you have an indigenous group living in a forest, central governments are not real excited about recognizing that group has title or that group gets to benefit from those forests. So that's been the problem. Yeah.
I know this talk isn't really about management practices, but could you address the argument that young forests are better at sequestering carbon than mature forests?
Okay, yeah. So that argument, whether young forests sequester more carbon, there's this idea that there's a thrifty young green tree and that old forests are sort of dying, right? And I think that generally that's been, I don't want to say debunked, but that's been undermined a lot in ecological research.
In all forest types?
No. So forests that can, redwood forests are a great example. They continue to sequester more carbon. Individual trees continue to sequester more carbon over time. But even like an old growth Douglas fir forest that looks like it's kind of falling apart, in those really old forests, there's a lot of carbon there. For a young forest to get to that point takes a long time. But of course, that young forest is sequestering, if you look at the kind of path that it's sequestering, the rate that it's sequestering at, it's going really fast. But for it to get to that point, so you don't want to cut down the old forest in order to replace it with young forest. But certainly, if you have a young forest, it is sequestering a lot of carbon, and there's a lot of management that you can do to make it sequester more quickly. And in particular, you can give trees more room to grow. So plantations that are real tightly spaced are not great or are not optimal at sequestering carbon. So if you remove trees, you improve the structure of the forest because it starts to look a little bit more, in most forests, like it would have historically. But you also sequester carbon more rapidly. So that, in terms of the different types of forests, though, there are some forests that, for example, forests that have like pretty frequent fire return intervals, like lodgepole pine forests, where they're going to kind of grow. They might be tightly spaced, and they might burn or get a bark beetle infestation, and there's not going to be a ton of carbon potential there. But those forests aren't in the market. So one reason you can have a project around here is because we have redwood forests. So you're sequestering a ton of carbon. Some of the projects, it'll be interesting to see if projects come online in less productive forests. You would have to have like a large extent. Yeah.
Which makes me wonder about the eastern United States, that in the last 100 years, aren't we
Sure,
growing
more and more
for-
trees,
If
yeah.
they were on board with this cap and trade, wouldn't we have an automatic pile of prospective carbon sequestration there?
Well, so when I mentioned the TIMOs, the investors that are in the
Yeah.
market, most of them are in the eastern US. And to make a project pay off, often it means that you don't want to harvest a lot of timber, and a lot of the eastern forests are harvesting less timber. So certainly there are a lot of projects coming onto the market from the east, like from Maine and that area. It's not always because of this new forest growth, though. They're often established forests,
Oh.
because you're starting above. If you do a reforestation project, it's a different type of project. And I did notice, there's only a few on the market, but Sierra Pacific has several post-fire reforestation projects. So that'll be interesting. They're new, so I don't know a lot about it.
I have one more question. If it fails in California, how would it fail? Where are the risks?
So the cap and trade market as a whole failed in Europe because they flooded the market with allowances. So industry said, this is too expensive, you need to release more allowances into the market to offset our emissions. So basically, allowances got down to such a low price that industry could just buy its way out of pollution. It didn't work. The market didn't work to reduce emissions.
Do you think industry intentionally sabotaged the system?
Well, I don't know, but I mean, certainly I think it could have been predictable that if you just kept giving allowances, that eventually they would be worthless. Because it was like inflation, like a hyper. So California learned from that experience and has set like kind of a floor and a ceiling price. But there are other ways that it could fail. It's all based on legislation, and so the legislation has to be renewed. The next time it's renewed is 2020. So, I mean, the market is just, it's not a make-believe market, but it's a market that's supported by policy. And so if that policy goes away, the market goes away.
So a Republican California legislature could kill that sucker tomorrow.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think a Republican California legislature is not super likely.
Yeah.
I mean, the legislation to renew the bill is is in draft form. I mean, it hasn't been introduced, but I mean, I think it's unlikely that it would just disappear. And actually, AB 32 that put this in motion was signed by Schwarzenegger. So it's, in California, it's kind of, I don't know if it's bipartisan, but certainly Schwarzenegger was a Republican.
Yeah.
All right, well, thanks for spending some of your Friday evening with me talking about cap and trade. I appreciate it.
Thank you.